I was reading earlier this week about a couple from Atlanta that had planned a trip to New York to go see My Fair Lady on Broadway, and they were super excited about this. They bought their tickets, well in advance. They flew out to the city. They stayed in a nice hotel. They arrived at the theater, and the place was just absolutely packed. There wasn't a single empty seat except the one right next to the gentleman. And he found that odd. He leaned over to his wife and he whispered, "Can you believe that somebody didn't show up? I mean, this show's been sold out for months." And just then the woman on the other side of the empty seat leaned over and she quietly said, "Well, that seat was supposed to be for my husband, but he passed away." And of course, the guy's really embarrassed. He feels terrible about it. He's like, "Oh, I'm so sorry. Didn't you have any friends or something that could have come with you to take his seat?" She said, "No, they're all at the funeral." We've all got our priorities, don't we? Last Sunday, we started what I said was this 2-part series about our priorities, about what matters most in life. And it's important to take time to reflect on what our priorities really are, what really matters to you. If we're not intentional about asking those questions, then our priorities can often slip out of alignment, sometimes in ways that seem absurd, like the woman at the play. But as Christians, we want our priorities to align with Christ's. And thankfully, Jesus made it crystal clear what should be at the top of our list. In the Bible, he gives us these 2 greatest commandments, 2 priorities that form the foundation of a life well lived. Out of the 613 Old Testament commandments, Jesus distilled all of it down to just this statement. Matthew 22, verse 37 and following. "You must love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, and all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. A second is equally important. Love your neighbor as yourself." Last week, we explored the first of these, what it really looks like to love God with all your heart, soul, strength, and mind. And today, we're turning our attention to the second one, which Jesus says is equally important, loving our neighbor as ourselves. And to understand what that looks like, I want to turn to Luke's gospel, where Jesus has another conversation with another Old Testament scholar, one of these experts in the law. And this time the conversation wasn't sparked with the question, what is the greatest command? It was, what must I do to inherit eternal life? And Jesus, as he often does, he answers a question with a question. He says, well, what do the scriptures say? How do you read them? And the young man responds, well, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, strength, and mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. And he must have been listening to Jesus, right? He maybe heard the first sermon that Jesus gave talking about this, or the other conversation that he had with it. And so Jesus, I imagine, smiled widely and nodded his head. Yes, that's right. Do this and you will live. But then he asks a follow-up question, which really reveals his heart and his motivation. In Luke chapter 10, verse 29, he asks, and who is my neighbor? You see, in Jesus' day, most rabbis would have taught that a neighbor refers only to fellow Jews who keep the law. But Jesus came to expand that definition and to challenge the comfortable limits that people had placed around love. So he responds with one of the most well-known and beloved parables ever told, the story of the Good Samaritan. It's a timeless tale, a story about a man beaten and broken, left for dead on a dangerous road. Jesus sets the scene in the following verse, verse 30, saying, a Jewish man was traveling from Jerusalem down to Jericho, and he was attacked by bandits. They stripped him of his clothes, beat him up, and left him half dead beside the road. And as Jesus paints this vivid picture, he gives us a living, breathing illustration of what it really means to love our neighbor. And it starts with recognizing a neighbor in need. Love recognizes. A Sunday school teacher was once telling this story to her students. And, she told them all about the Good Samaritan. And then she asked them, she said, well, if you came across a man in the road who was lying there all beaten up and bloody, what would you do? And after a moment of silence, one little girl finally spoke up and said, I think I would throw up. Honest and probably not too far off from how many people would react. But while the first two passerbys who saw this wounded traveler didn't lose their lunch, their response wasn't a whole lot better than that either. Jesus continues his story. He says in the next verse here, verse 31 and 32, by chance a priest came along, but when he saw the man lying there, he crossed to the other side of the road and passed him by. A temple assistant walked over and looked at him lying there, but he also passed by on the other side. Notice that these weren't ordinary temple goers, These were religious leaders, a priest and a Levite. And both men saw the injured man. They noticed him, but they didn't recognize him. Not as a fellow human being in need, not as someone made in the image of God, and certainly not as a neighbor worth stopping for. They weren't the ones who beat him up, but they were still part of the problem. They had the position, the power, and the ability to help, but they didn't see his pain as their problem. They were too busy or too preoccupied or maybe just too self-righteous to stop. And sadly, that attitude has not gone away. Today, the world is full of people lying by the proverbial edge of the road, hurting, overlooked, ignored, but in a culture that's rushed and distracted and desensitized, where we barely know our next door neighbors' names, it's easy to pass by on the other side. We're always in a hurry, always moving, and often we don't see people anymore, at least not in the way that love calls us to. But then Jesus introduces this third man to the story. In verse 33, he says, then a despised Samaritan came along, and when he saw the man, he felt compassion for him. See, unlike the priest and the Levite, the Samaritan didn't just see the man, he recognized him. He didn't focus on race or religion or risk. He saw a fellow human being in pain, and he allowed the sight to stir his heart. And that's where loving your neighbor begins, with eyes that are open and hearts that are soft. Real love notices the overlooked. Real love sees beyond the inconvenience or the discomfort. Real love recognizes a neighbor in need. But seeing someone isn't enough on its own. The priest and the Levite both saw the man, and yet they walked away. The Samaritan saw and refused to walk away. Because love doesn't just stop at recognizing a need. Love responds to the need. In the following verse, Jesus continues, and he says in verse 34, going over to him, the Samaritan soothed his wounds with olive oil and wine and bandaged them. And then he put the man on his own donkey and took him to an inn where he took care of him. This wasn't a case of thoughts and prayers from a distance. The Samaritan didn't just walk up to the guy and say, I'm really sorry this happened to you. I'll pray that you feel better. And then move on, go up about his business. He didn't just feel bad for the man. He did something about it. This wasn't just an emotional response. His compassion moved him to action. He uses his own oil and wine, valuable resources in that day, to clean the wounds. He gives up his seat on his own donkey, likely walking the rest of the way himself. He pays the innkeeper 2 silver coins, 2 full days' wages, and then says, if it costs more, I'll come back and cover it when I return. That's an open tab for a total stranger. And we haven't even mentioned the risk. The road from Jerusalem to Jericho, the reason Jesus set the story there is because that road was notoriously dangerous. It was often referred to as the way of blood because of the frequent robberies. Stopping to help someone in this area was risky business. The robbers could have still been nearby. Plus, the Samaritan didn't know if this man was dead or alive, or maybe this was a setup. It was a trap. He stops to help the guy, and then other people jump out of the bushes and attack him. This is a picture of compassion that costs something. Time, energy, comfort, money. He put his resources and ultimately his own life at risk to help another person. And here's something I've often wondered about. What did the Samaritan have planned that day? Was he on his way to a wedding, a business deal, maybe a long-awaited family reunion? He could have come up with a dozen different excuses of why he couldn't help. I don't have time. I don't know this guy. He's not my responsibility. He's dangerous. I've got my own problems. But he didn't do that. He allowed his plans to be interrupted because someone needed help. He gave his time and his treasure to take care of a complete stranger. That's what compassion does. It responds. Love isn't just something that we feel, it's something that we do. It moves toward the mess. It takes initiative, even when it's inconvenient. In fact, that's why the term Good Samaritan is so widely recognized today. The dictionary literally defines Samaritan as one who is compassionate and helpful to a person in need. But remember, before Jesus told this story, nobody thought that. That's not what the word meant. To Jesus' audience, the idea of a good Samaritan would have sounded like a contradiction in terms. And yet, it was his compassion, not his credentials, that defined him. Real love shows up. It takes initiative. It moves toward the need instead of away from it. Whether it's checking on a sick friend or stopping to help someone with car trouble or delivering a meal or just listening to somebody complain about their day. Love responds even when it costs us something. And now it's one thing to help someone that you like, someone that you already care about, but the Samaritan's compassion went much further. His love crossed a line that most people in his day would never have dared to cross, because love reaches. It reaches across borders and boundaries. One important detail in this story is often overlooked. Jesus never actually uses the phrase Good Samaritan. That's a label that we've added to the story over the centuries. In fact, Jesus, the term that he uses is much the opposite. Look again at verse 33 here. He says, "Then a despised Samaritan came along." The word despised would have hit his audience like a slap in the face. To first century Jews, the Samaritans were religious heretics and racial half-breeds. Although Jews and Samaritans shared an ancestry going all the way back to, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, their relationship had been fractured by centuries of political division, cultural hostility, and theological differences. There was a deep-seated bitterness on both sides. You may remember the time that Jesus stopped to talk to the Samaritan woman at the well in John chapter 4. She was shocked that Jesus sparked up a conversation with her, not only because, he was a man and she was a woman and that just wasn't normal in those days, but also because he was Jewish and she was Samaritan. Her words continue to explain the situation to us today. She says, "You are a Jew and I'm a Samaritan woman. Why are you asking me for a drink?" And then John puts a note there explaining why she would say that. For Jews refuse to have anything to do with Samaritans. This animosity wasn't just cultural, it was personal. And yet in Jesus' story, it's not the respected priest or the devout Levite who shows mercy. It's the enemy. The one least likely to help is the one who does. And you can imagine the shock and maybe even the offense in the crowd listening to Jesus. The Samaritan, in their mind, should have been the villain of the story, and yet he was the hero instead. He crosses every social, ethnic, and religious barrier to help someone in need, someone who, under normal circumstances, wouldn't have even spoken to him, who would have been happy to spit in his face. And that's the point. Love doesn't stop at lines drawn by society. It doesn't ask, is this person like me? Do they deserve it? Love simply recognizes and responds to the need. James, the brother of Jesus, emphasizes this aspect of Jesus' radical teaching when he warns us not to show favoritism or partiality based on social or economic status. In James chapter 2, he writes, "Yes, indeed, it is good when you obey the royal law as found in the Scriptures. Love your neighbor as yourself. But if you favor some people over others, you're committing a sin." This is essentially like a one-sentence summary of the story of the Good Samaritan. It's easy to love people who look like us, think like us, talk like us, agree with us, sit on the same side of the political aisle as us. But loving those who are different, difficult, or even hostile toward us, that's where real love is tested. Don't just love the people that are easy to love. Love the unlikely ones too. Jesus could have made the hero of this story anybody. He could have just left his ethnicity out of the equation entirely. But he chose a Samaritan in order to teach us that loving your neighbor means crossing those dividing lines with compassion in your heart and mercy in your hands. Over these last couple of weeks, we've explored the two greatest commands ever given. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, strength, and mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. Jesus said that everything else in the law and the prophets hangs on these two commands. In other words, if you don't get these right, you're not going to get any of the rest of it right either. Last week, we focused on what it means to love God. We talked about giving Him our full devotion. Not half-hearted faith or a Sunday-only commitment, but love that consumes every part of who we are. And this week, we've turned our attention to what it looks like to love others. Jesus didn't just demand that we love others. He demonstrated it through this story. And in the parable of the Good Samaritan, we learn that real love recognizes our neighbor's needs. It responds with compassion and action, even if it's inconvenient. And it reaches across social and even religious lines to extend mercy to everyone. And then, after telling this story, Jesus looks the man who asked the question in the beginning right in the eye. And he looks us in the eye. And he says, "Now go and do the same." Those words aren't just a conclusion to the parable, they're a call to action. They are Jesus' marching orders to everyone who would claim to follow him. And at its core, the command to love your neighbor is a command to show kindness and compassion to the people around you. You know, all of them, your husband, your wife, your kids, your parents, your friends, your coworkers, the teller at the bank, the checker at the store, the liar, the adulterer, the bigot, the immigrant, the outcast, the reject, the loner, the partier, the atheist, and yes, even the person in the pew next to you. Church, let's not just be known for what we believe, but for how we love. Let's be the kind of people who reflect God's heart to a broken, divided, and hurting world. Let's love God with all our heart, with everything that we are. And let's love our neighbors, not just in word, but in action. Let's go and do the same. Next week, I hope you'll all join us as we celebrate the resurrection of Jesus on Easter Sunday. But in the meantime, let's love God and love our neighbors deeply and wholeheartedly. And let's continue to do that every day of our lives. And right now, let's express our love for God through song as we stand and sing together. Let's sing, church.